Okay, the next item of business is the debate on motion 15401 in the name of Megan Gallagher on Scotland's housing emergency. Again, I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Megan Gallagher to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Housing Bill was the golden opportunity to address Scotland's housing emergency. Yet we have a bill introduced by this government that doesn't even mention building of homes. A severe lack of spades in the ground when communities right across the country are in desperate need for new housing developments. The SNP promised that they would deliver 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, but they are miles off meeting their own target. Their anti-house building agenda has undoubtedly stagnated the market, and they have exacerbated the problem through rent controls and by cutting £200 million from the housing budget. No wonder half of Scotland's population is now living in a local authority area that has declared a housing emergency, including the Minister for Housing's own backyard. We are in the midst of a deepening housing crisis. Over 15,000 children are homeless. The number of applications in households assessed as homeless are at their highest level since 2012. Hundreds of thousands of people are stranded on local authority waiting lists, and over 10,000 children are in temporary accommodation in Scotland. The solution to the housing emergency is to build more mixed tenure homes. But what we have is a bill that is fundamentally flawed. Presiding Officer, Parliament is due to debate the bill at stage 1 by the end of November, but given the serious concerns raised by stakeholders and developers, we are calling today for the bill to be rewritten. We do not take this decision lightly, as there are sections of the bill that we do support in principle surrounding homelessness prevention and care to act. But given the issues that I have just outlined, why did the SNP not bring forward a standalone bill on homelessness, given how many people, especially children, in Scotland are without a safe and secure home? This would have shown that the SNP are serious about ending homelessness in Scotland for good, instead of attaching this issue onto other housing-related matters. But the main reason for my party's opposition to the bill surrounds rent controls. Studies going back decades, from New York in the 1980s to Berlin more recently, show that rent controls have serious unintended consequences of reduced supplies and increased costs. Rent controls in Scotland have been described as ruinous and likely to damage a further part of our economy that has suffered at the hands of this government meddling in recent years. They will do much more harm than good. Recent figures show that around 70 private housing providers are leaving the property market every single month, according to the Scottish Landlord Register. And it's no coincidence that this is a direct consequence of the SNP's policy on rent controls. The result... Paul
Sweeney. I thank the member for giving way. She makes a point about property owners selling their property, but surely that won't destroy the housing stock itself. It's simply transferring it to different ownership, and that itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's perhaps people who own multiple homes are simply redistributing that property in a way which might be more efficient for future occupation.
Megan Gallagher.
But what we need is mixed tenure housing to fix the housing emergency that we are currently in here in Scotland. And combine that with the rent controls, it's not going to fix the situation that we're in. And the result of rent controls will be a shrinkage of available property means and a lack of congruence between the supply and the demand of rental properties. Homes for Scotland have warned that the SNP's proposed changes to the housing legislation will increase the cost of a new home by £30,000. Through changes to rent controls. That's eye-watering amount. This will only make it harder for first-time buyers to get on the housing ladder, and it makes no sense whatsoever to prevent people in Scotland, especially young people, from becoming proud homeowners. Regretfully, though, Presiding Officer, this is not the only problem should this bill continue to stage 1. We have already seen the loss of potential investment in the build-to-rent sector. Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of potential developments have not proceeded due to uncertainty around the Scottish Government's lack of strategy. The result is that investors will take their money elsewhere, meaning less growth to our economy. With the lack of council housing, there is a dependence on the private sector to provide more homes and affordable housing. We simply cannot afford for more private housing providers to leave the market. And I will be fair to the Minister. He did inherit this disastrous bill and the ideas behind it from a former Green Minister, but he must have known whatever he was going to inherit was going to be economically incoherent. Despite a year of consultations and significant engagement with the housing industry, particularly the much-referenced Housing Investment Task Force, the Government has continued to ignore practical suggestions such as the creation of a balanced framework to protect tenants while offering greater predictability for investors. Combine a lack of common sense with this Government's obsession with ideological-driven policies, this bill was always a recipe for disaster. Presiding Officer, we have heard a lot of outrage towards the bill in recent times, no less from the Greens, who have a First Minister's question tomorrow on this very topic. That's why I can't understand why they're not supporting our motion at decision time tonight. We both disagree with the approach to the Scottish Government and how they have taken forward their policy on rent controls, albeit for different reasons. But surely there's common ground to send this Government back to the drawing board to listen to the housing sector and stakeholders, to bring back a bill that will not harm the housing sector, a bill that will tackle the housing emergency. The SNP may wish to swing a wrecking ball at the private sector, but in doing so, they are harming our economy and preventing young people from climbing the housing ladder. That's why the bill should be demolished, with rent controls reduced to the pile of rubble that they deserve. With that, Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I now call on Shirley-Ann Somerville to speak to a Move Amendment 15401.3. Cabinet Secretary, up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. And it is a good opportunity to have another further update on the housing bill within the Chamber, because although addressing the housing emergency is not confined to primary legislation measures, it is a very important part of our work. Because dealing with the housing emergency obviously extends to much more than just legislation. When the Government declared the housing emergency, it was to move past the debating of definitions and move on to focused actions. And since that declaration, we've worked with local authorities to boost the supply of affordable housing, working closely with those receiving the biggest share of the additional £40 million committed to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme to bring into use or acquire existing properties that can deliver this year. We will utilise this year's almost £600 million budget by progressing the affordable housing approvals and site starts, and we've published a dedicated delivery plan so that planning plays its full part in addressing the housing emergency. Having listened to representations, we have responded by confirming that the rent cap that will underpin our approach to rent control under the housing bill, bringing certainty for that sector. But introduced in March, the housing bill proposes a reform package to help ensure people have a safe, secure and affordable place to live. The bill will help end homelessness and strengthen tenants' rights. It will also address long-term factors that will help Scotland to address the housing emergency. Certainly.
Gallagher.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand that the policies that her government is trying to push through this Parliament has stalled roughly £3.2 billion worth of housing developments in Scotland? And how does she reconcile that with the housing emergency that we're trying to tackle?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as a minority government, Presiding Officer, the Government cannot push a bill through Parliament. We also have the debates coming up on Stage 2 and Stage 3, and we look forward to continuing the discussions with colleagues across the Chamber on the changes they would wish to see. That's a productive way of going around how we deal with the bill rather than calls to scrap it. Presiding Officer, our homelessness prevention measures will shift the focus away from crisis intervention and towards prevention. We need to avoid households going through the trauma of homelessness in the first place. And rented sector reforms will make renting a home more affordable for private tenants through stabilising rent levels in rent control areas. And we know that a good quality and affordable WEG-regulated housing system can help tackle poverty, including for families with children.
Patrick Harvey.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She says that the measures will make rents more affordable. Can she explain how amendments which require that the maximum action that could ever be taken in a rent control area keeps rents rising faster than other prices, faster than inflation? How does that make rent more affordable?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I appreciate this is one of the areas where Patrick Harvey and I will just fundamentally disagree on this aspect of rent controls, because I do think while it is the government's continuing priority to eradicate child poverty, and one of those aspects is through rent controls, we do also need to provide certainty to those private investors to ensure that we have investment here in the capital and across the country. Because we know that that balance is required, and appropriate protection for property rights of landlords, the support for investment, but always to ensure that we are protecting tenants as well. But let's be very clear, Presiding Officer, that we do continue to listen. And that's why we have already, through the Minister's statement very recently, said that we will move forward with consultation on exemptions to the rent controls, whether that's in issues, for example, has been raised with us for the build-to-rent market and mid-market rent. That is a very conscious attempt from the government to continue to listen to ensure that we are doing that balance. If I can point, though, to what is in the motion, but is also what is being, or what will be read into support by this Parliament for the Conservatives' motion today. The motion talks about redrafting. The press comments talk about scrapping this bill, Presiding Officer. So that's scrapping prevention from homelessness. That doesn't help with tackling the housing emergency. And they're talking about scrapping protection from overly high rents. That does not help with the housing emergency, nor does it help those in poverty who are in difficulty in the private rented sector. So this Parliament will have the opportunity to debate this bill at stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3 to move amendments. The Government is very keen to continue that dialogue, but what we will not sway from is our determination to move forward to tackle the housing emergency, to have rent controls, to protect those in poverty, to provide certainty for private investors, and most importantly, also within the bill, about the prevention duties. That's what the Tories want to do, Presiding Officer. They want to scrap this bill, and that will in no way, shape or form tackle the housing emergency. It will make it worse, and that's why I moved the amendment in my name. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Mark Griffin to speak to and move Amendment 15401.2. Mr Griffin, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Quite often we are suspected of making political capital from issues affecting people's lives by the public and often each other as well. There are 40,000 homeless cases across Scotland last year, and us in this Parliament, we have been accused of standing in this chamber, wringing our hands and doing not much about it. We're accused of repeating the same numbers at each other. 10,000 children, 110 deaths in our streets, 1 in 4 in housing need, 20% less money for affordable homes. Now, those accusations have been made because we're not elected to make sympathetic speeches. Our job is to pass the laws of this country to stop those everyday tragedies. And in this case, we have the power, we have the motivation and the means to give families the safe, warm, secure homes that they need to prevent the harm that we know is being caused to them while they are homeless. When we talk about becoming MSPs to change the world, that's what we mean, not grand sweeping statements or gestures. What we're talking about is just making sure that no one is using shower or toilet water to cook their meals with on our watch. Now, when the Government talked about introducing a housing bill, we were engaged, we were positive and keen to get going, because we know that things are absolutely horrendous and we believed that we can help. But I'm not sure what's happening from the ambition to the development of this legislation, because the bill was and is it's a mess. Yes, it talks about rent controls and we do support regulation, but the gap between legislation and the ability to deliver it's an absolute chasm. Yes, it talks about homelessness prevention, but cash-strapped public services have no confidence in delivering on those lofty ideals. But the deepest chasm, in my mind, though, is the total lack of any mention of the number one issue that we face. We just don't have enough homes. And this bill is a glaring opportunity to put solving the housing emergency in the front and centre of our mission as Parliament and for government. Instead of talking endlessly, we could do what actually needs to be done. Get on with building houses. Help people. Now, it seems to be a radical suggestion, but it shouldn't be. We should be driving up the supply of homes, get the ones that are already there back and get families into them, into use. We can absolutely fix this. We have the power to do it. We have a housing bill waiting and ready, as long as it's brief, because I'm really restricted for time.
The best way to deliver more affordable homes is through the budget. And when this budget comes forward, if we present a budget which has more affordable homes, will Labour vote for it or will they not?
Mark Griffin.
I hope that is in this budget. You know, for the last 6 months, the Cabinet Secretary, the Minister, has talked about me as a Labour spokesperson lobbying an incumbent government to provide additional funds. The UK government has delivered. The Scottish Government have talked about housing being their number one priority before they got extra money. Now that extra money has come, it doesn't quite seem to be as high as a priority as it once was. What we find ourselves in is a situation that is not entirely surprising. Scotland has been run by a government of wasted opportunity. We have a National Care Service bill that fails to deliver care, a land reform bill that doesn't reform land ownership, a human rights bill that's disappeared and doesn't exist anymore, and now we have a housing bill that doesn't build a single house. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government seem to have forgotten what it's here for, but Scottish Labour haven't, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. I now call on Maggie Chapman to speak to and move Amendment 15401.1. Again, up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Greens believe that access to safe, warm, affordable housing is a fundamental human right, essential to our health, happiness and ability to fulfil our potential as human beings. That's why the New Deal for tenants was a key priority for us this parliamentary term, and through the Bute House Agreement saw Patrick Harvie introduce the Housing Scotland Bill earlier this year. That basic fundamental right, a place to call home, is far from realised by far too many Scots. The briefings we've received for today's debate paint a stark picture. A 143% increase in the number of children stuck in temporary accommodation in 10 years, with over 10,000 children without a permanent home. Gender inequality baked into the system, leaving women exposed to additional and avoidable harm. Minoritised ethnic communities, on average, spending longer stuck in temporary accommodation. And Scotland having the UK's largest disparity between renting and owning, with homeowners paying over 30% less a year than renters. So I want to focus on that last point. We must use this legislation to strengthen tenants' rights, making housing more affordable for them. That's why rent controls in the private rented sector are vital. And they must deliver genuine affordability, not just predictability or stabilisation. Rent stabilisation won't protect tenants if it locks them into ever-increasing costs. And rent controls are normal. Across Europe, they are used to prioritise tenant security, although the mechanisms vary considerably. Rent regulations in Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden and elsewhere ensure that increases reflect the quality of housing, the environmental considerations and local affordability standards. They prioritise security of tenure, preventing market volatility from dictating excessive rent rises. Elsewhere, rent freezes and rent reductions are used to tackle unaffordable rents. The recent Scottish Government rent control proposal, set at CPI plus 1% up to a maximum of 6%, will not enable these mechanisms in Scotland. It will not adequately tackle the unaffordable housing costs in our country. It shows limited ambition, favouring landlord protections and certainty over those of tenants. It is also misaligned with the urgency of Scotland's housing emergency. The policy's gradualism contradicts the stated ambition of eradicating poverty, particularly child poverty. Rising housing costs are one of the main factors exacerbating poverty. Without stricter controls, we risk failing to alleviate this burden. Housing costs are, of course, closely linked to broader economic contexts too. Interest rates, broader inflationary trends that drive demand. Effective tenants' protections would address these broader pressures, insulating tenants from market fluctuations, rather than placing the burden on them to absorb costs. International practices highlight that capping rent independently of inflation rates and wage growth considerations in rent controls allow tenants more stable financial planning and security. The goal of rent controls is genuine affordability, not simply predictability. Our vision for rent controls includes the ability to reduce rents, not just limit future increases. It includes the possibility to freeze rents, as we did earlier this session through emergency legislation to support tenants during the cost of living crisis. We believe that rent controls must be attached to the property, not the lease, so that the cost is never a barrier to tenants leaving a home and new tenants aren't hit by sharp increases. And they must be linked to quality to drive improvements in our housing stock. So we must not water down the housing bill and lock in above-inflation rent rises. I urge colleagues across the chamber to support the amendment in my name this afternoon, which I move. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call on Willie Rennie again. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Rennie.
You see the toll that's taken on people who are homeless or desperate for a new house. They live with it all day, every day, all night, all year round. And they are drained. They are anxious. They're unwell. They're arguing in the family. They are desperate for a change. And us in here, we don't know what that's like now. We're living in a different world from what they're living in. And that needs to come home to the priorities of this government, because the government knows that they've made a mistake. They've made a mistake over a number of years, and that's why they're changing their policy now. We might debate on whether the policy changes are right, but the fact that they're changing policies now is an indication that they have got it wrong, and we are in a position with a housing emergency in many local authorities, including the Housing Minister, which means that it is stark. And it's stark right across the country with the 10,000 children we've talked about in temporary accommodation. Their life is in limbo. And what was depressing most of all, when it was quite clear there was a housing crisis coming, was that the government cut that affordable housing supply programme by such a large degree. And I know they say it's somebody else's fault, but it was their budget decisions that led to that situation. So they made the emergency even worse. Now, to give the government credit, I think they are making steps in the right direction. I think planning decisions yesterday were actually an improvement, removing the infrastructure levy, the capacity and the expertise in planning departments and the best practice hub in the centre. I think might make some pragmatic improvements. I do still have concerns about access to land supply in areas that are viable. I think that's still an issue which I hope the Minister will look at. But I think the planning decisions yesterday were a step in the right direction. I also think the rent control changes, I still remain sceptical about rent controls as a whole, but I think the rent control decisions the previous week about CPI +1, but crucially excluding mid-market rents and also build-to-rent, I thought was a good signal to investors that this is a sector that they should be looking to invest in, because this is about restoring confidence with the industry, because their confidence was rock bottom. I attended the Homes for Scotland conference just a few weeks ago, and they were in a desperate state. They were desperate to build new homes. And remember, we cannot do it without these people. You may not like these people, but we cannot do it without these people, because they build houses. We're not going to do it all by the government or by councils or by housing associations. We're going to need them to make this work, and therefore we need to build confidence with these people. And I think the steps that the government's taken are moving it in the right direction. I would urge the Minister to perhaps, and we've discussed this previously, about the language around about the energy performance. I think using specifically passive house does strike fear in the hearts of some that believe it's a specific standard that is required, when in fact we should be aiming for a high energy efficiency standard as a whole, because what we need is houses built at volume and quickly to a really good standard. But to specify passive house, I think, would be a mistake. Well, it has been specifying passive house. It is in the language, Mr Harvey, and therefore what we do need to have is clarity exactly what government means. And we're aiming for a high efficiency standard rather than a specific technique or specification. That's what we should be aiming for. Now, do we redraft the bill? Do we start again? I mean, we've got the amendment process coming. We will support the Conservative motion and the Labour amendment, but we should be looking at trying to get the government to go further than where they are just now in order to make sure that we get an end to this housing emergency, because I've just had enough of it.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We now move to the open debate. I call first Miles Briggs, to be followed by Gordon MacDonald. Up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Edinburgh is at the epicentre of our housing emergency and homelessness crisis. These are words I've spoken throughout the time when I served as shadow housing spokesperson for the Conservatives. But we know that support services for vulnerable groups are at breaking point, and those experiencing homelessness now in the capital are at record levels. The First Minister stated when he became First Minister that he wanted to be honest about where the Scottish Government was going wrong. And in relation to the housing emergency, I think you can sum that up in 2 words: rent controls. Yep. All parties across this Parliament have welcomed the fact that the Scottish Government have declared a housing emergency. But we have to be honest, and Scottish Government have to be honest, that the housing bill is not going to solve those problems. The homelessness crisis facing people in Scotland, especially here in the capital, is only getting worse, and they are living with the consequences of decisions taken by SNP and Green ministers. The prevention duties which ministers have pointed towards already exist and are being ignored. So we need to see ministers focus on the homeless crisis now, and that means fixing our broken system. Because local authorities' homelessness services are in systemic failure across the country today. And that is no more pronounced than here in Edinburgh. Around 700 households in Edinburgh are currently facing a real prospect of not knowing where they'll be living come Christmas Day, due to the Council's proposal to end the use of non-HMO compliant temporary accommodation. This is an incredibly serious situation, and it needs an immediate solution, and I hope ministers are, if I can get some time back. Yeah.
Most of it, yes. Cabinet Secretary.
I'll very briefly say ministers have already had a meeting with the Council on that today. Following the committee meeting, we've offered another meeting at ministerial level on Friday, but officers and officials will be working on it tonight and tomorrow. So we are absolutely engaged at both official and ministerial level on that.
Miles Briggs.
I welcome that from the Cabinet Secretary, and I hope she'll be able to update MSPs from across parties very soon on that, because we know that there is real concern on what will be a loss of bed space, and the fact that the Council is routinely now struggling to find accommodation. That is not only seeing other councils across Scotland being asked to take the housing emergency and individual families, but councils in England as well. There should be no prospect of people suspending these protections, and they need to remain in place for households, including the 25 families with children who are being affected as well. Instead, I hope that ministers will definitely and urgently be looking towards what support they can provide Edinburgh City Council. And it's something we need to see action on, because ministers cannot sit idly by while hundreds of households do not know where they will be come the 1st of December. And if we do not see action from government with the Council, it will completely undermine any remaining pretence that Scotland's leading the world on homelessness and housing rights, as the Cabinet Secretary said earlier. Presiding Officer, Crisis say in their briefing that the Scottish Government should set out a clear vision of what homelessness prevention will look like and practices in place which will actually get us there. Local authorities are at breaking point, and the prevention duties which will be introduced, and all of us are in agreement need to be put in place, will effectively just add to the burden facing local authorities. So we need to see ministers urgently outline to Parliament what will change across all government portfolios and what fresh leadership will be brought to the housing emergency. Because for some time, charities and experts in the homeless sector have warned ministers that this bill isn't going to fix the housing emergency, but all the energy is going into it by Scottish Government and by officials. I believe the Scottish Government should pause. They should redraft this bill for it to become a homelessness emergency bill, for us to focus on what we agree on and get the emergency action we need to see across our country. We need a bespoke approach to Edinburgh and the crisis facing my constituents here in the capital. We're not seeing that. And ministers saying they're having meetings on meetings on meetings is an example of where we are seeing failure to actually address the housing emergency and the homeless crisis we face. That is why Scottish Conservatives have called on ministers to redraft the housing bill, as it fails to address the factors which are creating this housing emergency. And I support the motion in Megan Gallagher's name. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Jackson Carlow. Up to 4 minutes. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Housing Bill was introduced, I was a member of the Local Government Committee. We took evidence in parts 1 to 4 of the bill, with only the section on rent controls creating much discussion. Presiding Officer, it's important to understand the current housing situation across Scotland and all the key factors impacting on the Edinburgh housing situation, especially the 5,000 families who are currently homeless. The total supply of new housing in 22-23 reached the highest annual level since the financial crash of 2008-09. There are now 624,000 social homes in Scotland, which at 23% of all homes is the highest proportion in the UK. The National Records of Scotland report, published in June, highlights that across Scotland there are 2.7 million homes and 2.5 million households. To be clear, that's 186,000 homes that are lying empty across Scotland. Since 2007, the Scottish Government has supported the building of 133,000 affordable and social homes, and across all tenures and sectors there have been 293,000 homes built, a 12% increase compared to a population increase of only 7%. Presiding Officer, the key factors impacting on the Edinburgh emergency housing situation, despite 33,500 homes being built in the city across all sectors since 2007, are as follows. The capital's population has increased by 15% since 2007, while at the same time short-term let businesses have removed over 8,000 properties to serve the ever-growing tourist market. The previous Tory government policies pushed up construction inflation and reduced workforces through Brexit, forcing house building to construct less for more. The cost of living crisis pushed more families out of home ownership due to high mortgage rates, adding to the 7,000 private homes lying empty in the city. In the last year, a 14% increase in the private rented sector for a two-bedroom property, taking monthly payments to £1,000 compared to £400 for social rent. This is also not helped by the previous Conservative government, who froze local housing allowance rates for a number of years, which looks likely to be frozen again by Labour next year. Student numbers are yet another factor due to increased numbers in recent years. Students now make up 20% of the Edinburgh population, and there are now 50% more students than school pupils in the city. While there has been some building of purpose-built student accommodation in the city, it's only enough in most cases to guarantee their first-year accommodation place. After that, they join the general population looking for a home. To tackle these increasing demands on social rented sector, Edinburgh Council has a stock of 20,000 homes, with a further 20,000 homes in the housing association sector. However, Edinburgh Council, which is a Labour Conservative administration, has 1,200 empty council homes. The average time a void council home is not available for rent in Edinburgh is 555 days, and the loss of rent estimated at £1.7 million over a 9-month period. So, Edinburgh is a challenging case in relation to housing due to the many moving factors that impact on availability of homes. In addition to record house building, the Scottish Government has put in place policies that address some of the issues I've raised, including the Empty Home Partnership, the Second Homes Double Council Tax Charge, short-term letting licences and rent control areas. We need to get the balance right in the bill between protecting tenants in private lets and encouraging developers to build homes in the private rented sector.
You need to conclude.
I also welcome the commitment to build a further 110,000 affordable social rented homes.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. I now call Jackson Carlaw to be followed by Paul Sweeney, up to 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Colleagues might be slightly surprised to see, after 17 and a half years, me stand up to make a contribution for the first time in a housing debate. But I have left, I have to say, the precocious policy interventions and half-pursued master plans to others throughout that period. And I would say to the Scottish Greens that, frankly, fervour over pragmatism leads to a housing emergency. And is it not a tragedy that here we are in a Parliament, 25 years old, with a policy wholly devolved to us, that we are sitting here today discussing what is, in fact, an absolute shambles and a housing crisis across Scotland? And perhaps if I and more parliamentary colleagues than have clearly decided are interested in the subject this afternoon had engaged in this issue in a more pragmatic and collective way, we would have made some progress. Because time and again, I've heard in health debates that I've participated in, the argument put that there is a demographic in Scotland which has led to an ageing population and a crisis in healthcare. Well, that ageing demographic is also one of the uncontrollables which has led to housing stock not coming onto the market for perfectly good and valid reasons. People have lived longer, they've lived in those houses longer. We also have the fact that in my lifetime there has been a fundamental change in the way in which people operate socially. So there are far more single occupancy homes than there were historically. And there are far more people now in further education than there ever were when I started out. 1 in 7 now, nearly all of 7. And that's led to a huge explosion in demand for student accommodation. Now, all of these things are uncontrollables, which I understand we have to wrestle with. But it has led, to my astonishment, to my own small local authority of East Renfrewshire declaring a housing emergency, because it had, according to the Scottish Government's own figures, the highest percentage increase in households living in temporary accommodation anywhere in Scotland. And I recognise directly the contribution of Willie Rennie, because, to my astonishment, the people now coming to speak to me with casework issues in my constituency, who are in that bereft position of having no idea where they are going to be living or what they are going to do or offer to young children to whom they are absolutely devoted and determined to offer the best start in life, when they are all crammed into temporary accommodation, one room at times, with no understanding or knowledge where things are going to progress after that. And we've got to do far better. Now, in the last debate, I think it would be fair to say we had a bit of a rammy at the Labour Party and their government at Westminster. But in East Renfrewshire, we try collectively on many issues to be as pragmatic as possible. And the local authority there, a Labour-led minority administration, I think has set out quite genuinely and quite pragmatically why we have the increase in homeless applications in East Renfrewshire. One of those problems, of course, is the abolition of the local connection benchmark, which for a small authority means that people just turn up, present and become part of the issue for that local authority to have to deal with, when they don't have the major resources that some others might. But we also, the Labour leaders said, we acknowledge that the Scottish Government has recognised that there's a housing crisis on a national basis, declaring as much. However, this does not sit well with the removal of some £200 million in funding for the provision of affordable housing. It's not much point recognising an emergency and then acting one of the tools that was there to seek to try and deal with it. Presiding Officer, the Leader of the Council has written to the First Minister informing of our situation in East Renfrewshire, added to yesterday by East Lothian, which became the 13th council to declare that emergency. The Scottish Government's own figures must surely be a wake-up call to the government that they need to take action. And this means, as my colleague Megan Gallagher has argued, that we have to pause this bill and redraft it with a bill that pragmatically we can all work together to achieve, which directly addresses Scotland's homeless emergency.
Thank you. I now call Paul Sweeney to be followed by Bob Doris. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And it is a fact that Scotland is facing a housing emergency, as borne out by the fact that now 13 of Scotland's 32 local authorities have declared one. And the culmination in this disastrous situation has not been something that's happened overnight. It's certainly been a long-running trend that is a feature of Scotland's post-war history. It's an interesting fact that perhaps the member for Eastwood might recall this era, but in the mid-1970s, over 50% of all housing stock in Scotland was social housing, the highest concentration of any country in the democratic world, in fact only surpassed by the Soviet Union. Today it is 24%, and that in large part was due to the decision by the Conservative government in 1980 to introduce the Right to Buy scheme, which led to 494,000 houses being sold to the private sector. Yes, happy to give way.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
I wonder if the member thinks that the fact that the Labour Liberal administration in this place failed to remove the right to buy has anything to do with the challenges we face.
Paul Sweeney.
I think it's a good thing that the Right to Buy legislation was repealed, and I certainly recognise that's been a helpful progress in stemming the flow of social housing stock to the private sector, because it has been a source of major concern. Indeed, we have a situation where it's been calculated that around £2 billion of profit was generated in the asset growth of those sales, and that's an effective massive subsidy from the state to the private sector. Indeed, it comes at a rate of £25 of profit per day. So the issue now arises to how do we redress that balance? It's one thing to stem the flow, how do we recover it? And I would suggest to the Minister that it would be a helpful thing to introduce a national buyback scheme. I think that's something we want to see introduced, whereby the state can recover that social housing stock. And we know that many housing associations do actively pursue such buyback schemes, and it's a very helpful way to recover social housing stock. And certainly it could be partially financed. Sorry, if I may just proceed for a moment. It may actually be useful to recognise that of the £1.18 billion spent on housing benefit, a large share of that goes to subsidise private landlords. So perhaps a more efficient utilisation of that public expenditure might be in recovering ownership of that housing stock. And indeed, it may help to offset some of the massive cuts that the government has introduced, such as a whopping 26% cut to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, which has led to 1,800 social housing projects and affordable housing projects stalling across Scotland. And I think it is helpful to recognise that rent controls and rent restrictions do have a place, and certainly they have a place in the private rented sector because of that rapacious profiteering that we have seen. As was mentioned by Ms Chapman, the privilege of being able to afford a mortgage gives you a bonus of 30% lower housing costs on average, whilst those who are in the private rented sector certainly are facing a massive premium to live adjacent to someone who may be paying far less for the same type of property. And I think that's a gross inequality and is at the heart of so much of the issues around poverty in Scotland that we face today. And so there are many other myriad issues that we need to address as part of the housing bill. Rent controls are one thing, but it's also important to recognise that housing stock quality is another. One of the unintended consequences of the 1915 rent controls was that it effectively killed off factoring of tenemental property in Glasgow, leading to large-scale slums in the city by the 1960s, and it led to the demolition of around 100,000 tenement properties in Glasgow over a 20-30-year period. Today, around three-quarters of Glaswegians live in tenement properties, and there are still a number of major reforms needed, not least in ensuring that there are 5-yearly condition and fabric inspections, and that there is compulsion on owners to carry out those inspections in the same way one might have to do with their car to pass an MOT, to make sure that there are owners' associations collaborating and cooperating effectively, to use our community-based housing association network in Glasgow to build that capacity and ensure we have a much better performing housing stock, as well as simply introducing rent controls. I hope the Minister will address that in the round in his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. We now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Bob Doris. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Doris.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to discuss the Scottish Government's housing bill in this afternoon's debate. And I have to say that there is much to value in this housing bill. It's also worth noting that parts 5 and 6 of the bill is very much about homelessness prevention duties and duties in relation to domestic abuse victims, about doing all we can to prevent an individual or a family from getting into crisis in the first place, potentially ending up in an under pressure, straining homelessness system. In other words, to stop them feeding into those housing emergency pressures in the first place and stemming that human cost where we can. The Conservative motion is wholly ignorant, I feel, of these very important issues. That's because the Conservatives are playing the politics and not looking at practical policies and the legislation before this Parliament that can make a real difference. Not a silver bullet, but can make a real practical, on-the-ground difference. Policies, 4 minutes, Miles, I would love to, but I'm afraid I can't. Policies to which I'm now pleased to turn to. At the heart of the preventive nature of the legislation is the Ask and Act duty. This will place a duty on public services such as the Police Scotland, the NHS, housing associations, various local authority departments and others. So should they be concerned that there are vulnerabilities which could potentially down the line lead to homelessness, they have to ask and they have to act. The risk is identified and support is offered before homelessness is looming. Now, I acknowledge that could put additional pressures on those bodies, and we must look at that through the budget process. There also has to be trauma-informed training for staff. That has to be looked at, and we have to make sure it's not simply a signposting process back to local authority homelessness departments. But this is a real potential to change the flow of people in tenancy, precariousness and into the homeless system. This can do something meaningful about that. I'd also add to those bodies that could be added to the legislation the Department of Work and Pensions. We can't force them to, but we can concord that. Likewise, the Home Office, given their role in asylum-seeking accommodation in Scotland, and possibly also the Social Security Scotland. Now, I want to turn to the area in relation to domestic abuse. Section 44, with a new pre-action requirement where social landlords seeking to evict for rent arrears would have to take this into consideration. And Section 45 would have to link the domestic abuse policy of social landlords to their policies and evictions directly. I've done work with Financially Excluded, a wonderful group based in Glasgow, who will tell me about many women, nearly always women, who have ran up significant debt, whether it's on credit cards, or whether it's in store cards or other bills, or rent arrears, because they're under financial abuse as part of a domestic abuse scenario. They can still be evicted for the rent arrears, and that shouldn't be allowed to happen. And often the abuser keeps the tenancy and a woman has to flee. Where there's no risk of physical violence, why is the woman having to flee the family home? Can this legislation do more in relation to that? The bill that will deal with house building programmes, because we've heard about that a lot this afternoon, it's the budget bill, isn't it? It's the budget bill. And we'll have to come together as a Parliament and provide more money to build the bricks and mortar of houses in this country. And we can debate the erosion of the UK Government to Scotland's capital budget all we like, but let's come together on the budget bill to build more houses for Scotland. Finally, I thought Mr Sweeney, with one or two exceptions, gave a very good speech, and I would say to him that housing associations in my local area are actively seeking to buy back properties from the private sector, and that's using Scottish Government funds. More funds would be welcome, but they are actively doing it, and I commend the Scottish Government amendment here this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr Doris. We now move to closing speeches in a call. First, Patrick Harvey, up to 4 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very happy to close, and I'm pleased that Bob Doris finished by recognising some of the wider contents of the bill, because up until Mr Doris spoke, very few, or relatively few members had spoken about the wider context of the bill, the homelessness prevention duties. In addition to those that Bob Doris mentioned, the measures to address issues around joint tenancies and the way that those end. That's something that's been raised with me repeatedly, and the frustration of not having legislation yet that can address that, as well as bringing older tenancies up to date. And some of the softer tenants' rights, in a sense, that are about making a house a home. These things really do matter. Some members, perhaps those who brought the debate, are clearly motivated principally by an ideological hostility to rent controls, an ideological desire always to put the profits of owners and investors ahead of the human right to decent housing. But I do hope that, that those Labour members who've spoken, I'll give way in just a moment, I do hope those Labour members who've spoken will work with the bill. The opening speaker seemed to suggest that there were changes that he would like to see to the bill that would address some of the issues he's concerned about. I'd like to see those amendments. I'd like to see any constructive changes brought to this bill, but we need to get past stage one. We need to support the bill and let it go forward in order to debate any amendments. And, you know, having been criticised in the past by Labour, first for rejecting a rent freeze that was clearly unlawful, then for imposing a rent freeze but doing it too slowly, then for having done it too quickly, then for ending it too soon, then for the fact that it didn't last long enough. I do hope that Labour achieve a coherent position on rent controls and that one that we can work with. I give way.
Briefly, Miles Briggs.
I thank the member for giving way. I just wondered if the member has ever reflected that since the introduction of rent controls, Scotland now has one of the worst record on homelessness. We have 10,110 children trapped in temporary accommodation, 42 children becoming homeless every day. This is a consequence of rent controls.
Yep. Patrick Harvey.
No, but not a jot of evidence that that is the consequence. Not a jot of evidence that that is the consequence of the temporary rent freeze. And Mr Briggs knows very well. Mr Briggs knows very well that a temporary rent freeze wasn't capable of disincentivising any investment, because it was about existing tenancies only, not new build. Look, the Tory motion is very clearly a demand for housing policy that goes back to putting landlord wealth ahead of the human right to housing. As for the SNP amendment, well, in itself it's fine, and if it passes, I'll vote for the amended motion, but clearly it preempts the Green amendment, so we won't be supporting it. And there are amendments to the bill. It's really important to acknowledge that even in an area where rental conditions have been assessed, showing the maximum possible evidence of extreme rent levels, even in those circumstances, the strongest action that could be taken under a rent control area, under the proposed changes to the bill, would mean above inflation rent rises continuing in perpetuity. Your rent rising faster than your food prices, faster than your energy prices, faster than your transport costs. And I don't think that that's going to achieve affordability. Even in a future inflation crisis, with a spike of inflation similar to what we've seen in recent years, even then it would not be possible under the new proposals for a rent freeze to be used. As for supply, Presiding Officer, yes, of course supply is an important part of the picture, but it is not only about numbers, it's about the type and price of housing that's built. We're seeing build-to-rent, for example, coming forward at £1,200, £1,400, £1,500 a month. That is not the kind of housing Scotland needs. We need to be understanding the distinction, and that's why I hope that the Government will change its position from treating mid-market rent and build-to-rent as though they're the same. They're not the same. Let's give an incentive and a protection to mid-market rent, to genuinely affordable homes, not to the people who want to build homes that are merely used for price gouging.
Thank you. I now call Mark Griffin. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank Megan Gallagher in closing for bringing the debate to the Chamber. It does strike me that the only time we properly debate housing issues is in opposition time, and that's something maybe the Government would reflect on. Before I go back to the substance of the debate, I also want to thank Miles Briggs for raising the temporary accommodation situation here in Edinburgh. I had hoped to successfully lodge an urgent question, but unfortunately it wasn't picked. So I would appreciate any updates from the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister on that situation. It must be absolutely terrifying for the residents of Edinburgh who are in that situation. Now, as my opening remarks set out, there are few better opportunities available to us right now than using the housing bill to end the housing emergency ripping through Scotland. Now, the Government will be aware that only yesterday East Lothian Council became the 13th local authority to reluctantly declare a housing emergency, citing difficulties in bringing forward sites for the development of homes. Another council declaring a housing emergency. We had North Lanarkshire Council at committee last week talking about being in the same situation where they could declare a housing emergency too. That there are just area after area demonstrating the urgent need that we have for more homes. And the reason for that housing emergency is simply the fact that we don't have enough. A number of speakers have mentioned in the debate that we need to take urgent action to drive up the supply of new and appropriate houses. Sorry, in a 4-minute speech I can't. Willie Rennie mentioned the changes to the planning system. We welcome those too, but we think we could go much further. We could radically fix the planning system that developers are talking about as being the #1 problem holding up developments. Now, Willie Rennie said as well that we need those builders, we need those developers to build the homes that we need. We should absolutely be giving them the confidence to build and invest, to make it easier for them to do so, rather than making it more difficult. Now, I also agree with Bob Doris and Patrick Harvey about the importance of parts of this housing bill that we absolutely shouldn't lose. We should have a workable system of rent regulation. We should be preventing homelessness and making sure public organisations play their part. We should have more robust rights when it comes to evictions and a whole range of other issues that we support within the bill. But I think Miles Briggs touched on the crucial point here. There is no point in having these measures in the bill unless public authorities are funded to deliver them. And after over a decade of cuts, local governments have no money left. That is why they are at systemic risk of failure, as set out by the housing regulator when it comes to their homeless prevention services. And that has got to be the key issue. And I think the Finance Committee was scathing in its report, the assessment of the financial memorandum. So that has got to be the key point for me, for Patrick Harvey, for Bob Doris and others who support these measures, to see them funded properly, because I want this bill to work. But I think for it to work and for it to address the current housing emergency that we are in, that this bill should deliver a statement of intent. It should define this housing emergency and require the government to take measures to end it. Now, I'm always willing to engage with the Cabinet Secretary, the Minister and Government on that detail, but my point remains that any housing bill that is brought must surely at least acknowledge the primary challenge to Scotland that this housing emergency represents. The Presiding Officer asked members to support them in my name, simply asking Parliament to recognise the emergency situation we find ourselves in and to start building the houses to get us out of it.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. I now call on Paul McLennan. Up to 5 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's just been over a month since the Cabinet Secretary and I last updated Parliament on the Scottish Government's response to the housing emergency. In that time, we've continued to make significant progress, especially in working with local authorities facing the greatest challenges with homelessness and temporary accommodation. But let me be clear, addressing this emergency requires partnership, and I'd like to record my thanks to all local authorities who have intensified efforts to support our shared goals. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government continues to directly support individuals here and now by providing £7.9 million to mitigate shortfalls in local housing allowance rates, helping to protect tenancies. The UK budget's freeze on local housing allowance is disappointing. Now, this is a policy that began with the Conservative Government and now, disappointingly, continues under Labour. The Joseph Fowlshe Foundation called it deeply worrying that no social security adjustments were made to effectively address homelessness and reduce hardship. Very quickly.
Bob Doris.
Can I ask the Minister that figure of £7 million or so to help support local housing allowance, could that be redirected for tenancy support and to prevent homelessness? Because housing services are under strain right now. Could that money be diverted if the UK Government step up to the plate on local housing allowance?
Can be used obviously for a number of reasons through the Chair, for a number of reasons, and that's where we've been working with local authorities in regards to flexibility in funding that they receive. Now, I want to move on and just talk around about short-term actions such as reducing social housing voids in partnership with local authorities, which are already making a difference. But long-term solutions are crucial and critical, and the Housing Bill will play a vital role in reforming the rental sector and preventing homelessness. Building on Scotland's existing protections, I've only got 5 minutes, I'll going to pick up some of the points that you mentioned earlier on in terms of that. We remain committed to implementing long-term rent controls to ensure affordable rents, which are essential in tackling poverty, especially for families with children, and that's been mentioned by a few in the Chamber today. The rent cap must also apply between tenancies to provide stability for tenants. However, we aim to balance this approach to ensure continued investment in the private rented sector, thereby expanding the supply of quality, affordable options to rent. Many private sector stakeholders have welcomed clarity on the rent caps form. I've only got a short period of time, Mr Roy. Many private sector stakeholders have welcomed clarity on the rent caps form, and we plan to launch a consultation in spring 2025, seeking views on how to ensure that the powers to exempt certain types of prevention from rent control can be used in a way that stabilises rents for tenants in rent control areas, whilst continuing to deliver new and improved rented housing. This consultation will provide new housing built specifically for private rent, including in the mid-market rent, which we've heard today, and other purpose-built private rented accommodation, again, which has been referenced on a number of occasions. Our approach balances immediate actions to meet urgent housing needs while establishing a stable long-term framework. This is also underpinned by the work of the Housing Investment Task Force, where we have engaged with investors and developers to understand how a rent control system can work for tenants while supporting private investment. An input from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations has provided valuable insights into how rent controls will impact on social landlords offering mid-market rent provision. I want to touch on a few points, and particularly thanks to Mr Harvey in terms of the work that he done on the bill, and I think he was very right to mention the point in terms of the points he mentioned about tenants' rights. That was only mentioned, I think, by yourself, Mr Harvey, and I think that's incredibly important. Megan Gallagher also touched on, for example, around about the number of landlords. That's actually increased between August 22 and September 24 by 3%. So that's actually increased. And polling actually shows that rent controls are supported by 82% of people in Scotland, including 61% of Tory voters. And I've also in previous engagement, I've mentioned that with Mr Briggs also. I want to come back to the point that Mr Griffin mentioned in terms of that. And this is a really important part. We talked around about funding for housing and including capital funding. So if the Scottish Government does bring that back and increases the funding, will he vote for that? He has to vote for that, and his colleagues have to vote for that to make sure we get increased funding on that particular point. And I will continue to push that point in that regard. I want to thank Willie Rennie for his comments. I've taken on board what he said, and I think obviously I know the CABSEC's met with him as well, and happy to engage with him in the future going ahead. I think there's one other closing couple of points. I think Gordon MacDonald touched on outside factors. Local housing allowance fees we talked about, 62% cut in financial transactions. And I know Mr Callaghan talked around about that, but your government, UK government, made that particular choice to cut our capital budget as well. The right to buy also was through your government, and that made a major impact. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, let's be clear. A vote for the Tory amendment will be a vote to scrap the bill, to scrap rent controls and to scrap prevention duties, and a vote to ignore poverty. Now, we won't redraft the housing bill to solve every economic problem, but we'll continue taking decisive action across Scotland to deliver the housing our communities need. This bill gives renters certainty, progresses prevention duties, quickens investment into housing and tackles child poverty and poverty more generally. Support the SNP motion. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, and I now call on Graham Simpson to wind up the debate. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I actually think this has been a good debate, and I'm glad that we've had it. When the housing bill was first published, we'd not declared a housing emergency, but we were certainly in the throes of one, and this bill has made things worse. Now, to be fair, we had rent controls before we saw this bill, and that has led to two things. A, rents going up, and B, investment drying up. A more ruinous policy you couldn't imagine. So what does the government do? It includes more rent controls in the housing bill, with the Minister sticking with the policy in his announcement on stage 2, and we aren't even at stage 1 yet. He really should know better. He actually has a housing investment task force that doesn't include Homes for Scotland. But goodness knows what they talk about, because the money isn't coming here anytime soon. He's scared investors off. Now, the Minister and I, you might not believe this, Presiding Officer, but we go way back. He may not remember, but when we were both councillors, we both sat on the Commission for School Reform together. He does remember that. So I genuinely want the best for him. So I have to advise him as a friend to go back to the drawing board on this bill, because landlords are leaving the sector in their thousands, and that may please those who think that all private landlords are evil money grabbers, but for those with any sense, it's not a good situation to be in. The Scottish property, absolutely.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member to give me the opportunity just to... Could we have on record those that have put in briefings for MSPs, such as Crisis, such as Shelter, who often call on the government to do more, as they should, to tackle the housing emergency? Have they asked for this bill to be scrapped, as his motion wants to happen?
Graham Simpson.
We're calling for the bill to be redrafted, and if the Cabinet Secretary, if only...
Let's hear Mr Simpson.
If only she could be patient, because she knows I'm a positive guy. I've got some nice things to say, and it will please her. But the Scottish Property Federation estimates that £3.2 billion in direct housing investment is under threat from the proposals in this bill, and a survey by Property Mark suggests that 59% of landlords are selling their properties or leaving the market completely. The one part of the bill with any promise, and this will please the Cabinet Secretary, is the section that deals with homelessness, and we should concentrate on getting that right. Over 15,000 children, I don't know whether she's muttering that she's pleased or not, but she's muttering something. Over 15,000 children are homeless, and the number of applications and households assessed as homeless are at the highest since 2011-12. Shelter Scotland has condemned the Scottish Government over its record on homelessness. And they say the housing system is broken and in need of urgent and drastic change. Part 5 of the bill deals with homelessness prevention. The best way to end homelessness, of course, is to stop it happening in the first place. And that's why the Housing First model ought to be commonplace. The bill introduces an Ask and Act duty on relevant public bodies like health boards and the police to ask a person if they're homeless or threatened with homelessness, and to act if they are. This part of the bill does have the potential to make some important changes to how homelessness is dealt with in this country, shifting this from a crisis response to an early action prevention response, and that's good. But it's just a legislative framework, and much more work will need to be done on this. A delivery plan should be built into the bill, and there must be cross-departmental support for homelessness prevention across the government and public bodies. Prevention is about dealing with the root causes of homelessness. Now, there have been a number of very good contributions, perhaps not Maggie Chapman's, because she seemed to be rather in denial about the impact of rent controls, about the costs facing landlords. Willie Rennie spoke about the impact of homelessness on people. Miles Briggs talked about Edinburgh, as did, to be fair, Gordon MacDonald. And Paul Sweeney, I was pleased to hear Paul Sweeney talk about, though he didn't mention the Tenement Maintenance Working Group, the actual recommendations that group came up with to deal with the problems of tenements. And I was delighted that Jackson Carlaw mentioned students, because in September the Cross-Party Group on Housing published a report examining student housing options and experiences of homelessness in Scotland. Our report found that there is insufficient, suitable and affordable accommodation for students here, with thousands at risk of homelessness. We came up with a set of clear and challenging recommendations to the government, such as the integration of student housing into local housing strategies and more robust data on student accommodation. The Scottish Government must take more action to address student homelessness in Scotland and answer the concerns which will no doubt be expressed at the rally outside Parliament tomorrow, which I will attend. Presiding Officer, the bill is a mess, frankly. The Minister inherited some of the bad stuff in it, but he has stuck with them, and that's why, as Megan Gallagher
The member
rightly
must
says,
conclude.
Well, Patrick Harvey ought to know that I'm about to finish. That's why, as Megan Gallagher rightly says, he needs to start again. And if he does, he'll have our support.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Scotland's housing emergency. It's now a point of order. Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In this afternoon's debate on inheritance tax, Jim Fairley accused me of misleading Parliament. I pointed to the fact that last week the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity had omitted to draw to Parliament's attention his voluntary register of interests before quoting at considerable length the National Farmers Union Scotland. Today, the Minister raised a point of order asking me to withdraw my comment. I have no intention of doing so. His register of interests, last updated in May this year, quite clearly states, I am a member of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. Presiding Officer, it is one thing not to register an interest, it is quite another not to know that you have. Section 1.3c of the Ministerial Code states, it is of paramount importance that ministers give accurate and truthful information to the Parliament, correcting any inadvertent error at the earliest opportunity. Ministers who knowingly mislead the Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation to the First Minister. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. In response, I would say that the requirements for declaration of interest are set out in the Code of Conduct for members, and whether a declaration should be made is a matter for each member and not one for the Chair to rule on.